It turns out Borderlands 4 is pretty hard to run, so in this video we're not just going to be testing out the maximum graphic settings, we'll also be testing out, well, the high graphic settings if you go by the name, but if you look at the presets, it's actually the middle one. Anyway, we'll be testing out the 5070 Ti. I have the Asus Prime version. I'm running it at its stock out-of-the-box settings against the 9070 XT Steel Legend, again at its out-of-the-box settings. And, well, let's go ahead and see how the performance goes. So first, we tried maxing everything out at 4K, and it was pretty rough. Let me get my fat head out of the way. But don't worry, I will also be testing out upscaling. So this game does have FSR 4 support, as well as DLSS transformer model, so we can test that out as well. And I really think it's pretty much a necessity to get reasonable performance in this game. Anyway, so testing out max settings at 4K, both GPUs are hitting 23 frames per second on this run. I chose to just be on the new game start, but if you skip past the like prologue section, and I'm just running up the beach or straight to this first treasure chest here, if anybody wants to repeat the benchmark run. Anyway, 23 frames per second, and they were tied. I tried kicking on upscaling into the performance mode. Now, this game does work pretty well with upscalers. I think the art style does well with that, and just FSR 4 and DLSS 4 are really very good upscalers. So I do think it still has very acceptable image quality here, despite the fact that it's 1080p internal rendering resolution. But the problem is we actually still can't hit 60 FPS on these GPUs. And now again, it's still maximum settings. Anyway, we're at 55 versus 53, 4% lead for the 9070 XT and a 9% lead in the 1% lows. So I tried dropping down to the high preset, which is actually the middle preset if you look at the just number of graphics presets in the game, but it's not called medium, that's even lower. Anyway, back to 4K native resolution, I'm seeing 36 FPS versus 35. So 3% lead for the 9070 XT, although a 10% lead in the 1% lows, although that's only 33 compared to 30, so really not a great way to play the game. You really need upscaling in this game to get any sort of reasonable performance. So, kicking on performance mode, upscaling on the 4K high preset, we're now hitting 76 FPS on the 9070 XT and 73 on the 5070 Ti. So the 9070 XT has a 4% lead, and it's less stuttery. The frame time graph just looks a little bit smoother, and it has a 15% lead in the 1% lows. It has 69 nice versus 60 in those 1% lows. So anyway, you can get a playable experience using performance mode upscaling on the middle graphics preset in the game on these $700 to $800 graphics cards. But what if you wanted to play at 1440p? If you thought a $700 to $800 graphics card could max out this game at 1440p and at least hit 60 frames per second, you thought wrong. What you do get is about 44 FPS on the 9070 XT and 41 on the 5070 Ti, putting the 9070 XT 7% faster. And the 1% lows are actually 15% faster at 39 versus 34. So again, frame time graph just a little smoother on the AMD card here. Now, I tried kicking on upscaling. For a 1440p output, I find that the balanced preset is about as aggressive as I want to go. You can use the performance preset, but I think balanced does look a little bit better here. So using balanced mode, FSR and DLSS, we are at 76 FPS on the 9070 XT and 72 on the 5070 Ti, putting the AMD card 6% faster, but 60% faster in the 1% lows because some big frame time spikes that we get on the NVIDIA GPU that we're not getting on the AMD GPU. But this game does just stutter at times, so could have just had an unlucky benchmark pass there. For the 5070 Ti. I tried dropping down to the high preset, and the good news here is that they can at least now average over 60 FPS without using upscaling, just barely. The 9070 XT is hitting 65, and the 5070 Ti is hitting 61, 7% lead for the 9070 XT, although the 1% lows for both are below 60 at 56 versus 48, 17% lead for the 9070 XT. So here you'll probably still want to use upscaling even on the high preset on a 1440p display. So 1440p high DLSS and FSR 4 at the balanced mode gets the 9070 XT over 100 FPS now at 106. The 5070 Ti is not quite triple digits, it's hitting 95, still totally usable though, and that's a 12% advantage for the 9070 XT. The 1% lows are a 38% advantage for the 9070 XT at 83 versus 60. So we continually see a larger lead in the 1% lows than in the averages for the AMD card. And if you thought that at 1080p resolution, these $800-ish graphics card options would be just crushing this game in the triple digits, no, it turns out the 5070 Ti is actually short of a 60 FPS average, hitting 59, and the 9070 XT is just barely over 60 FPS at 63, giving it a 7% lead, 19% lead though in the 1% lows at 56 versus 47. If we kick on quality level upscaling, which I really don't like to go more aggressive than that on a 1080p output, I mean, this is only 720p internal rendering resolution, then the 9070 XT is good for 92 FPS, so still not triple digits even using upscaling at 1080p. But almost there, and the 5070 Ti hits 84. It's a 10% lead for the 9070 XT, and the 1% lows are a bloodbath because of some major stutters that we get on the 5070 Ti that just don't happen on the 9070 XT. So, I mean, it was an unlucky, benchmark pass, but the AMD card just isn't getting as many of those massive stutters as the 5070 Ti is. If we switch down to the high preset, at least at native resolution 1080p, these cards are now pretty smooth, although still not triple digits. It's 91 FPS on the 9070 XT, and the 5070 Ti is hitting 82. It's an 11% lead for the 9070 XT, and the 1% lows are a 31% lead for the 9070 XT at 80 versus 61. And if we go ahead and kick on upscaling, because we still weren't hitting triple digits, and this is a first-person shooter game, a lot of people do want to be around 120 frames per second. So if we're on the middle preset, which is called high, using quality level upscaling for a 1080p output, so 720p internally, we can now get triple digits. The 9070 XT hits 124 FPS, and the 5070 Ti hits 112. It's an 11% lead for the 9070 XT. The 9070 XT even has 1% lows over 100 at 103, putting it 27% ahead of the 5070 Ti, which has 81 for the 1% lows. So that is all of the benchmarks that I did. So we tested 1080p, 1440p, 4K, native, and upscaled at the maximum preset as well as the middle preset, which is called high. And what did we learn? Well, I mean, if you're comparing the 5070 Ti and the 9070 XT, we can say that the 9070 XT does run this game better. Now, I wasn't testing frame generation here, so if you were on a super high refresh rate display, the 5070 Ti does support ×4 frame gen, and the 9070 XT only has its a ×2 version available. Now, if you're coming from 60 or 70 FPS and you're on like 120, 144 hertz display, ×2 is really all you need because there's no reason to use frame gen to go over your monitor's max refresh rate. But it's worth noting that if you're on like a 240 hertz plus display, the ×4 frame gen might be something that you'd prefer over the extra, 5 to 10% of raw performance. But again, I saw more frame time spikes on the 5070 Ti than I did on the 9070 XT, and this has been a bit of a stuttery game in my testing, but most of my testing's been on NVIDIA GPUs, so that was at least kind of interesting. Thoughts related to that, by the way, is before I run any of this testing, I do multiple runs through this area to try to remove any shader compilation stutter. Because oftentimes, especially on Unreal Engine games, your first time through an area, the first time you run into a shader, you'll get a shader compilation stutter. And I do multiple passes through the area, and also when I change graphics settings, multiple passes through the area before starting to record benchmark runs to try to catch some of those shaders. So, and I ran the test in the exact same way, the same number of passes beforehand, testing the settings and the resolutions in the same order, and game restarts on changing settings and everything. And it just did seem to be the case that the 9070 XT was consistently a bit smoother on the frame times, which showed up in the 1% lows. Now, that's my thought on the like head-to-head between the two GPUs. Upscaling looked good on both. The FSR 4 and DLSS transformer model upscaling looked good on both and is really necessary in this game, and I was glad to see that it was available. So then the last thing I'll just say is thoughts on the game's performance. Well, for one thing, I'm only testing out this little like first intro area. I imagine that, if this is anything like other Borderlands games, when you get towards the end game, there's going to be so much going on screen, crazy weapons. You might have 4 players shooting rockets, tons of enemies. I would imagine that the performance we're seeing here is probably a best case scenario compared to a lot of the more demanding stuff you'll see. So if you think this is heavy, I think some stuff gets worse. Also, I noticed a couple of times, at least right here, do you notice that like the ground texture hasn't really loaded in correctly here? So that's another thing I noticed just kind of randomly on the game. Now, I think this was just a bug because it usually did load in. But yeah, that was kind of weird where the ground texture didn't load in properly there on the 5070 Ti on my 4K max settings run at least. Maybe you guys noticed some other issues in the side-by-side footage. But yeah, this game is incredibly demanding. And so it's one thing to not be able to run it well at its maximum settings. So I was really hoping that when we test it out, high preset, which again is the middle preset. It goes low, medium, high, very high, I think. And then there's the badass preset. Now we've got high settings, they're usable here. But again, performance mode upscaling, high settings on a 4K output. Just to get in kind of the low 70s in, like I said, what is probably not the most demanding area of the game. So, yeah, this is a very demanding game. It does look nice, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure it completely justifies the performance cost that we're seeing, especially when you're also pretty heavy on even the high settings. I mean, like honestly, if a 5070 Ti doesn't break a 60 FPS average at max settings 1080p, that's a little bit shocking. And when you're on your medium preset, again, it's called high, but it is the medium preset at 1080p, and a 5070 Ti is only hanging out in like the low 80s, in again, what is probably not the most demanding area of the game. It's just not great. Anyway, let me know what you guys think in the comments section. You guys interested in more Borderlands 4 testing, other GPUs, etc.? Let me know. Hope all of you have an excellent day.